Hey everyone, it's Erin with Counter Read, joined by Brandon, also of Counter Read. We are here for your pre-Nebraska versus Wisconsin check-in. We do these every week just to kind of give you a little bit of a, I don't know, gut check-in, whatever it might look like. Typically about midweek, heading in, it's Thursday, depending on when you're watching this. But before we hop into one, your questions, and two, just some of our general thoughts, Brandon, how are you today?
I'm doing well. It's Wisconsin Nebraska week. I know you were there. In 2011, I was there. Madison, Wisconsin was the first Big Ten football game I attended with Nebraska also playing as a Big Ten member, and I've always liked this series. It just makes sense on a lot of levels. Hasn't gone all that well for Nebraska, but that aside, I always have a little extra pep in my step, I guess, when it's Husker Badger week.
It is. It's a fun matchup. I think there's a reason that people were disappointed when the Big Ten came out with its protected matchups and its protected rivalries, and Nebraska only had Iowa as a protected rivalry. I think a lot of people were hoping that Nebraska would get two, and one of those would be Wisconsin, because for all intents and purposes, with the way that Nebraska Iowa sort of, just fits in that protected space because of the Thanksgiving, or I guess Black Friday matchup. At the same time, I think a lot of people do really look forward to Nebraska, Wisconsin. You had a great story at Counter Read this morning. Again, depending on when you're watching this, this would be Thursday morning, where you kind of talked about the similarities and then the lack of similarities between the two. And these are two programs that have always sort of felt aligned, whether that's because of Barry Alvarez and what he did when he went there and sort of took the Nebraska blueprint to create what he did at Wisconsin. But even now, there's similarities, but also some differences. So before we hop into the questions from YouTube, could you talk just briefly about that and kind of what you saw when you were putting that piece together?
Yeah, so I think, we think back 12, 13 years to when Nebraska was entering the conference. Like Nebraska, Wisconsin was one, along with Iowa, that just kind of made sense. And I think the Barry Alvarez link was part of that. Proximity compared to most of the rest of the Big Ten helps as well. Proximity to Lincoln, so that's always kind of been there. And I think back to those early Nebraska Wisconsin games. Both teams were pretty good at that point. 2012 was the last time the Huskers actually beat the Badgers, and that was a very memorable game where they rallied from 17 down, wearing atrocious uniforms to beat Wisconsin, also wearing atrocious uniforms. And then I think they played later that year. I don't remember. I've heard tale of a Big 12 or a Big 10 championship game in 2012, but honestly, can't recall what happened in that one. And since then, and Wisconsin's churned through some coaches. I think they've had one fewer coach since 2012 than Nebraska has. Now, it wasn't firing coaches until we got to Paul Christ. But the program, the difference was Wisconsin kept winning through all of those, and I think Alvarez's kind of influence was a big part of that as an AD. Nebraska didn't have that stability, and now the past kind of converge again a little bit in some ways. And you've got two highly regarded coaches. I mean, I think if Rule wasn't Nebraska's coach, like they were ready to go to Fickle. It's kind of always been the Nebraska water cooler talk. I'm sure it's a little bit different if you hear it from a Wisconsin side, but both teams are 5-5. Both teams are kind of limping home here a little bit, but watching both coaches' press conferences on Monday, I thought there was a markedly different tone. Like with Rule, the tough questions are about, what are you going to do at quarterback? What are you going to do about these turnovers? Luke Fickell was getting questions, based on some talk that reporters had with players about like program buy-in. And is this more difficult than it was for you, taking over Cincinnati? Real big picture stuff. So I think the vibe, for lack of a better term, is just a little bit different for these two. And it's totally based on where Wisconsin has been and where Nebraska has been and kind of expectations, I think, coming into the year.
Yeah, I absolutely. It's going to be, I when when we were talking about who was going to be hired, Luke Fickell's name was coming up quite a bit for Nebraska. And I think when, he ultimately was hired by Wisconsin, there were definitely fans who were like, hold on a second, wait a minute. I thought he wasn't available. And so this will be interesting. I am also excited for this matchup because Nebraska is still trying to get bowl eligible, has 2 games to do so. Wisconsin and Iowa are games Nebraska can win. I'm not going to say it's either our games Nebraska will win or even should win, but can is very, very key here. Nebraska can beat both Iowa and Wisconsin, so we'll see if that happens. It would definitely take some pressure off from the last week of the season if Nebraska can get to that 6-win mark now, punch it, stick it to a bowl game, and then be able to play a little bit more loose, I think, against Iowa. But let's dive into a couple of the questions that we got after Nebraska's loss to Maryland. A lot of you had really great conversation right here on YouTube, and we appreciate that. Some of it, you were just having conversation between each other, but we're going to address some of these questions. And Lone Dog, who I'm going to argue is not a lone dog on this pathway of thinking, basically said, I don't believe that Nebraska has a quarterback problem. One could reasonably conclude that Nebraska's quarterbacks need an upgrade in coaching. But after seeing so many interceptions committed by all of the quarterbacks, one might also assume that the problem then lies elsewhere. Perhaps the route designs are flawed. It's a really interesting kind of takeaway. And I would love to get your thoughts on it, Brandon. What do you think? Like I said, I don't think Lone Dog's alone in this. So what do you think when you kind of look at the quarterback situation and what might be going on specifically when we look at these turnovers?
Yeah, I think it starts from a strong premise. I mean, when the last game you played, all 3 of your quarterbacks threw an interception, and in fact, Purdy's interception, you know, right outside the end zone, was very similar to the interception that Sims threw in week 1 at Minnesota, and in fact, the route concept was pretty similar. I think there's something to that. Um, it's hard, and I know we've both done this for a long time, and you kind of balance this of like, at what point it's not like we're out here trying to like assess blame. We're trying to like increase understanding and understand things ourselves, right? But like it's hard to like throw it at the foot of the players sometimes, but it's hard to throw it at the feet of the coaches because we really don't see a whole lot of that part of it. The other thing that complicates this one for me is with Sims, okay, we have his Georgia Tech years, and like his level of turnover this year is crazy. And the sample size for him is still pretty small, but he's turning it over, including fumbles, once every 9 plays he's been on the field, which is just like, I mean, it's it's like off the charts. And that wasn't what he was at Georgia Tech, even though he was turnover prone. So that one's it's bizarre. With Chuba Purdy, we don't have a very big sample size with him. That said, he has yet to throw a touchdown, and because I think he start 2 games last year. He at least
I
played
think so.
significantly in 2 games last season. Um, you know, he hasn't thrown a touchdown yet, but I think he has 4 interceptions on about 50 attempts, and that's over 2 different coaching staffs. And then with Harburg, we have the biggest sample size this year, but it's still not even a full season and his first season. So it's a tricky problem. Turnovers are always a tricky problem, but I think it's tricky here because Sims is like so bizarre, like off the grid in terms of what his numbers are. And the other 2, we just don't even have a full season to go with on them yet. So I hate to give a half answer or a non-answer, but I'm not ruling out that there are some gaps here in the coaching because it is a common problem shared across 3 separate individuals.
I will say the one thing that I think it's like yes, I don't mean to do this as well where I'm kind of like I think there's kind of a combination here and maybe, some of it is in rules talked about it. And we said this on Saturday. He's typically more he's more in like in I don't the word insightful is not the right word. More just like he provides a little more detail on Mondays and Thursdays because he's had time to watch the film. He can dive into a little bit more of the specifics at that point. So like right away post game to ask that question, which some people had pointed out when I'm asking about turnovers, he's also in the moment still really like there's a lot of adrenaline and you're trying to process a lot of what just happened. So I get it. Not always. That question did though get brought back up on Monday. So it wasn't a game day only type of question. It was like, okay, now that you had 2 days, let's talk about that again. Let's talk about turnovers. The one that I do think that if we could provide true serum to him or to Marcus Satterfield or whomever they would talk about is that final decision to have Purdy throw, especially when you are on your third string quarterback. You are saying very openly to everyone when you are in that position that you're playing Chuba, he doesn't have a ton of experience, so you're putting him in a really really tough spot. Even if what you are seeing plays out well, where you think, okay, we see the opportunity here for what we're trying to do, you're still putting that particular quarterback who doesn't have that experience into a tough spot to make a decision that they may make 100 times differently with now that he's seen that play out. I'm kind of the belief that that is one where like I think they would say they would take it back and just run the ball because at the very least you could have kicked a field goal, gone up by 3 points, given your defense just a little bit of cushion. Because even though you have full faith in your defense, that defense was also starting to get tired. A lot of emotions were right there at the end of the game. Momentum was starting to swing. If you could have just gotten those 3 points, I get it. I'm not the head coach for a reason, but I do think that is one where like I'm going to probably be critical of it for a little while. And I think if you gave them true serum, they'd say, yeah, we probably should have run it. He didn't even really say that. He kind of alluded to, yeah, there's different decisions that you could have made, but like he is very much the person who goes, I take full blame. I'm not putting it elsewhere. I'm not going to talk about like, if we made that call differently, because really for him, it's like, this is my fault. I'm the reason that those decisions were made. So it is what it is. It's the coulda, woulda, shoulda kind of situation, but Nebraska's just not yet like I get what they were doing. They were playing to win, super respectable. But Nebraska's still just on that line where at sometimes you playing to win is also playing safe. And I think that Nebraska needed to go with a safer route on that one. And but we're not here to talk about Maryland. But I'm just saying it'll be interesting to see maybe what we are presented with against Wisconsin as we're watching Nebraska and the Badgers, because Heinrich Harburg has a high ankle sprain. Matt Rule said it was pretty bad. Those things don't heal all that quickly. He did say it's going to go down to game day, but it doesn't feel great that like he's going to. So then we're looking at Jeff Sims, we're looking at Chuba Purdy, and then that's where you need to be really, really smart. You're playing a night game at Camp Randall. You gotta be really, really. Sometimes playing it safe is playing to win. I know it's not the sexy answer, but it is what it is.
Yeah, it absolutely is. I mean, I wrote about it in the Wisconsin Nebraska in the game preview this week. I think because some of those turnover numbers we were mentioning, because Jeff Sims like numbers to this point are like so bizarrely below what you would have expected him to be based on his career numbers. Like, I think if he had some time to play, like it would be fair to expect him to kind of progress towards at least what his average is. I mean, this guy's played a lot of football. Um, that said, I could also see the argument for like, sure, things should work that way over a long enough span, but there's no guarantee that one or two more games is. Give
Mm-hmm.
me the relative unknown of Purdy, because yeah, there was the interception at the end of the game, a throw you'd absolutely like to have back, but it's like it was only his first turnover, and it's his first action. So let's see what that looks like. Maybe he has a better command of how Satterfield wants to operate things, and he just hasn't had the opportunity, or we haven't had the opportunity to see enough yet. It's possible.
It is, and I just went to go look because we're recording right around the time that Matt Rule is about to speak. So some of this could ever, but again, he was pretty clear that a lot of this is going to go into game, and I'm going to be honest, a lot of that is he probably knows what's going to happen. But you don't need Wisconsin to have the answers as well. It's just you gotta be smart. So one other question from Brian on YouTube that I want to address really quick in this video is again turnovers. He was kind of wanting more specifics on how we are seeing or how our perspective on the mental aspect playing into this. Basically, if it comes down to the mental aspects, how are we thinking about this? Because however, regardless of how you're practicing, they aren't practicing to turn the ball over, which I agree with. There's no greater microscope or pressure than during a game. The thinking that our success rests on only this one play, basically, like he was essentially diving into the fact that like when you are in practice, you will practice to not like, yeah, you're not practicing turnovers in practice, but like the game itself is a high pressure situation. So like essentially when I'm asking that question to Matt Rule of like, are you seeing this in practice? He was kind of wanting more details on this. So I will start really quick and then I'll throw it to you, Brandon. My point in asking that question was more or less this is a systemic problem that Nebraska seems to have a hard time correcting. So I was just more curious, is it something that you are seeing in practice? Because if you are seeing in practice, then it is going to be just compounded when you get into the game scenario. If you are absolutely not seeing that in practice ever, there are no interceptions in practice, there's no fumbling in practice, okay, that's worth noting because then you're getting into the game and into the high pressure situation, and then it's all just kind of like falling apart, for lack of a better term. And my kind of takeaway from how he answered that is he doesn't want to put any blame on anyone. And I'm guessing they're seeing some of that when when the defense is pressuring, when the ones versus the ones in practice are pressuring, when the defensive ones are pressuring the offensive ones. I'm guessing they're seeing some of that, but they're trying to fix it and correct it. So yeah, how do you work to that mental piece of it where you are essentially putting them in the best possible scenario where they also aren't freaking out in a high pressure situation and making decisions or whatever they might be doing that causes them to lose the ball? It is a deeper question than I honestly think anyone could have potentially gotten an answer for. Again, it came up again on Monday. I wasn't the only one asking this question. But we don't get to see practice. So it's hard to answer this question unless Matt Rule or Marcus Satterfield tells us exactly what's going on. So I think it's just, if I had to sum it up, I think it's a team that hasn't been taught. No, let me take that back. It's a team that hasn't quite figured out yet the attention to certain pieces of detail for whatever reason. And I don't think that's only true for Matt Rule. We saw it with Scott Frost. We saw it in teams past. This is just something that Nebraska has not been able to sort out, is that little attention to some of these details. We're watching Chuba run, holding that ball out for anyone to take it in front of him. It's little things like that, I guess. So like how do we teach that? And I'm guessing they're working on that in practice, or they should be. And I think that's why we were asking that question, is to understand that piece of it, mostly because we're not physically there to see it for ourselves.
Yeah, it's an attempt to trace the error, right? Like if it's happening in practice to the same degree that it happens in games, it's kind of like, oh well, we might just have three quarterbacks who are really prone to interceptions and fumbles, and then what do you do? If it's not happening in practice, well, then at least know that something in the transition from practice to games is where the issue is, and the old uh, old football truism, I guess, is you practice how you play. I guess it's not specifically football. That's kind of all sports, right? It's just a coaching cliche. Um, well, if only that were the case, if this isn't happening in practice. So then it gets really tricky, to kind of to your point, because I think you are talking about kind of mentality. You hear a lot of coaches, and I think a lot of really good coaches consistently talk about self-talk.
Mhm.
Luke Fickell brought it up this week at his Wisconsin press conference. John Cook talks about it all the time. I don't know if I've heard Matt Rule say those words specifically, but he's deep into kind of all of the ways that you can track and try to improve performance. So that said, like, you can have the training and you can have all of the support staff that Nebraska has, and you can work on this if you've identified it as an issue. But it's one of those things where until you're there, it's tough to be there. And I think a lot of this season, this first season under Rule and this staff has been trying to get Nebraska to the point where it can just truly be what's next, kind of Matt Rule's big catchphrase. And I think they've made a lot of progress there. That said, I think the turnovers are maybe the final frontier for that. And it might be the hardest one because turnovers are big. From the moment you start playing football, you're taught this is the worst thing you can do. Do not do it. You have to avoid this at all costs. And now you're doing it in front of 90,000 people at a program, not just a team, but a program that has the strangest like history with turnovers over the past 20 years that I've seen. And I've looked to see, like, does this stand out? And it very much stands out. So I think it's kind of the last dragon to slay in terms of the mental aspect of it, of getting to a point where you can be like, I'm going to turn the ball over. It's going to happen, and I'm going to be okay with it, because I think what we're seeing with the number that they have is, for whatever reason, they tend to compound. And last week against Maryland was perhaps the ultimate example of that. They just stacked up. It was crazy.
It is. It's honestly, it's something that truly should be studied. Um, and honestly, I think Matt Rule, being the kind of person that he is and liking the detail and wanting to know how he can change things and do things differently, I'm going to say in the off season he will be digging into these very, very specifically. I honestly wouldn't be surprised if in the spring we don't have like a talk with Matt Rule one day where he's like, I've spent time just evaluating turnovers across the FBS level, and here's what I found. And he's a very attention, and I'm not laughing at that because that's bad. He is somebody, I'm just laughing because I'm like thinking about, like, if that happens, I'm going to come back to this YouTube channel and be like, I called it. He's just a very, like, it's the way he approaches everything. He wants to know the best ways and the strategy and everything else. So I do really appreciate, and I know I speak for Brandon as well, we really appreciate just all of the conversation and everything that you have brought, one, to Counter Read. So when you head to counterread.com, the comments that you leave, but also to our YouTube channel, you have grown it really fast, and we appreciate that. So thank you. Keep sharing. If you haven't subscribed, we really, really appreciate it if you did, either here on YouTube, like and subscribe to this channel, but you can also head to counterread.com and become a subscriber. Both, we have free and paid options. The holidays are coming up. We'll have gifting options and different things that you can do for those that you love. We just appreciate the support and everything else. So Brandon, before I let you go for today, do you have any other quick thoughts?
No, I don't think so. It's going to be kind of a white knuckle ride, I think, for Nebraska football over these next two games, as they try to get one of them. But I'll go back to where we started. Like, it's Nebraska, Wisconsin, two 5-5 teams. Maybe the stakes aren't the highest, though it is bowl eligibility bowl again. But it's Camp Randall at night. Jump around is still cool. Even if you're from Nebraska, I think it's okay to say that. So I'm looking
It
forward to all of
is.
it.
It is. And I wasn't laughing. I was laughing at, I want to be wrong about staying 5-7 for this season so badly. I just so want to be wrong. So, like, over these next 2 weeks, let's make my preseason prediction wrong. That is my challenge, is let's make me wrong. That would be amazing. So thank you as always for watching, commenting, everything else. Again, we will continue to do these videos post game and as we head into the week, but even as we head into the off season, which hopefully is a little further into December, or even, however far into December, into January. We will keep these videos going even in the off season, but hopefully the off season is a ways away. Brandon, thank you. We will talk to you all later.